Here's a polished, flowing English version, suitable for the opening of your horror video. Kash Patel, former chief of staff at the Department of Defense, was actually born in Garden City, New York, a place with eerie legends and chilling ghost stories that many people might not know about. Today, I'm going to share some of these haunting tales that have left a mark on anyone who's heard them. Even Kash Patel wouldn't be immune to the chills these stories bring. But before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of the real horror stories we bring to life here. Let's get started with 3 true scary stories from Garden City, New York. The night was heavy with fog, casting an eerie stillness over Stewart Manor, an old, abandoned estate on the outskirts of Garden City, New York. Built in the late 1800s, Stewart Manor had once been a symbol of opulence and grandeur, a place of lively gatherings and lavish parties. But time had left its mark on the manor, and what was once beautiful now lay shrouded in decay and mystery. Its tall windows, shattered and clouded with grime, seemed to gaze out into the night like haunted eyes, while ivy clawed its way up the crumbling walls, entwining the manor in an unrelenting grip. Legends about the manor were plentiful, but one tale had endured, striking fear into the hearts of locals for generations. It was said that the spirit of Edward Barnes, a former caretaker of Stewart Manor, still roamed the grounds. In life, Edward had been a solitary figure, a man of few words, fiercely devoted to his duties. Though he had lived alone within the estate, he was often seen late at night, lantern in hand, pacing the grounds, ensuring every inch of the property was secure. Some claimed that Edward's loyalty had bound him to Stewart Manor, that even in death, he continued to guard the estate. On particularly foggy nights, townspeople spoke of a ghostly light that would appear near the manor, a dim, wavering glow weaving through the fog. The light, they said, came from Edward's lantern, held by his restless spirit as he prowled the grounds. Over the years, only the most daring of souls would venture close to Stewart Manor, lured by the tales of Edward's spectral watch. But the fear of encountering the spirit was enough to turn most visitors away. One night, however, a young historian named Rachel Foster decided to seek out the truth for herself. Rachel was known for her fascination with the supernatural, and Stewart Manor had captivated her since she first heard the stories. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and a barely contained sense of curiosity, she found herself at the manor's iron gates, which loomed before her like the entrance to another world. The gate creaked open with an agonizing screech, and as she stepped through, the fog seemed to wrap around her, swallowing any sound from the world beyond. The pathway leading to the manor was choked with overgrown weeds and fallen branches, remnants of a forgotten garden. Rachel's flashlight flickered, casting an unsteady beam across the path as she approached the towering silhouette of Stewart Manor. The fog hung thick, swallowing her light and distorting shapes around her, making trees appear as twisted shadows that loomed and swayed in the breeze. She felt an inexplicable chill, the kind that prickled her skin and sent a shiver down her spine. As she reached the manor's entrance, Rachel paused, catching her breath. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere of the estate resisted her presence. And then she saw it, a faint glow, deep within the gardens, just beyond the edge of her vision. The light flickered, casting an otherworldly glow against the mist. Her heart pounded as she realized it was the lantern, held by a figure just barely visible through the fog. A man, silent and still, his face hidden in the shadows. Rachel's breath caught as she stared at the figure holding the lantern, its dim light swaying gently in the fog. The man stood perfectly still, his outline barely visible through the mist, yet she felt his gaze fixed directly upon her. She couldn't see his face. It was obscured by the shadow cast from the brim of an old-fashioned hat, yet the sensation of being watched was unmistakable, almost as if the air itself held an electric charge. She gripped her flashlight tighter, her pulse quickening as she fought the urge to flee, forcing herself to stay rooted in place. This was what she had come to find, after all, the legendary ghost of Edward Barnes. As she took a step closer, the figure turned, the lantern light casting strange shadows across the twisted branches of the overgrown garden. Rachel watched, entranced. As he began to move, his footsteps silent, as though he drifted above the ground rather than walking upon it. She could barely make out the outline of his dark, worn coat, heavy and long, brushing against the mist as he moved. He seemed to follow a path known only to him, a path that wove through the garden, tracing the perimeter of the estate as though he were still keeping his vigilant watch over the grounds. Determined to capture every detail, Rachel followed him, her flashlight shaking in her hand as she moved slowly, careful not to make a sound. The fog was so thick that she could barely see a few feet in front of her, yet the lantern's glow was like a beacon, guiding her deeper into the garden. Every step seemed to draw her further from reality, the familiar world she knew slipping away as she crossed into a place where the past and present seemed to blur. The figure paused suddenly, as if sensing her presence, and Rachel stopped, holding her breath. She was close enough now to make out the texture of his coat, the worn fabric that seemed to have withstood years of weather and neglect. Her eyes traveled up to his hands, gloved in tattered leather, gripping the handle of the lantern with an almost unnatural stiffness. His face remained hidden, but she could see wisps of hair peeking out from beneath his hat, a few strands of gray catching the light. Then, without warning, he turned toward her, and Rachel felt an icy chill crawl down her spine. She froze, paralyzed by the sight of the hollow darkness beneath his hat, a void where a face should have been. It wasn't just shadow, it was as if his features had been erased, leaving nothing but an empty, haunting silhouette. Her mind raced, struggling to understand, yet all she could feel was an overwhelming dread, as though she had glimpsed something that defied the very nature of life and death. The lantern's light flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that danced along the garden walls, stretching and contorting in ways that made her feel as though the darkness itself was closing in. Rachel's instincts screamed at her to turn back, to flee from this impossible apparition, yet her feet remained planted, her curiosity battling with her fear. The figure began to move again, this time drifting toward the manor's back entrance, as if inviting her to follow into the depths of Stuart Manor itself. Rachel's heart pounded as the figure drifted toward the manor's back entrance, the dim light of his lantern casting an eerie glow over the crumbling stone steps. Every part of her screamed to turn and run, yet she felt herself drawn forward, as if some invisible force compelled her to follow. The fog seemed to thicken around her, muffling the sounds of her own footsteps, swallowing every noise except the soft creak of the manor's door as it slowly opened, seemingly of its own accord, welcoming her into the darkness within. The air inside was frigid, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Her flashlight flickered, casting trembling beams across the dust-covered floor and faded wallpaper that peeled away in long strips like ancient skin shedding from bone. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, and her breaths came shallow, visible in the chilled air. The figure stood just inside the doorway, lantern held high, casting distorted, nightmarish shadows that stretched and twisted along the walls. Rachel took a tentative step inside, her eyes fixed on the caretaker's ghostly form as he moved deeper into the manor, leading her down a corridor lined with portraits of the Harrington family, each figure captured in somber, lifeless poses. Dust covered the faces in the frames, yet Rachel could still see their hollow eyes, each pair seeming to follow her as she passed, their gazes cold and unyielding. She felt as though the very walls were watching, as if the manor itself was alive, waiting. The figure led her to the grand staircase, its banister wrapped in the same twisted ivy that had taken over the exterior, curling up toward the ceiling like the veins of some ancient creature. The caretaker paused at the foot of the stairs, turning to face her once more, and for a moment, Rachel thought she saw something flicker within the darkness where his face should have been, an empty, endless void that seemed to draw her in, whispering secrets of lives long gone, of lost souls bound eternally to this decaying mansion. With a sudden jolt, the lantern's light intensified, casting an unnatural glow that filled the entire corridor. Rachel's surroundings seemed to blur, shifting as if she were caught between two worlds, the past and the present, merging in a haunting vision of Stuart Manor as it once had been. She could see faint figures moving along the walls, silhouettes of people frozen in silent dance, ghostly remnants of the manor's former grandeur. The caretaker, Edward Barnes, was among them, his figure suddenly clear and solid, no longer a shadow but a man, young and strong, standing tall as he watched over the guests with his ever-loyal gaze. But then, as quickly as it came, the vision faded, leaving Rachel alone in the darkened corridor, the lantern's light once again dim and flickering. The caretaker's form was fading, slipping away like mist, dissolving into the shadows of the house. The air grew colder, pressing in on her, and an overwhelming sense of sorrow and loss filled her chest, as if she had borne witness to a forgotten tragedy, a life consumed by duty and bound forever to these haunted walls. Before she could fully grasp what had happened, the lantern's light vanished, leaving her in complete darkness. Rachel stumbled back, her flashlight finally flickering back to life. The house was silent once more, the heavy, oppressive stillness settling over her as she made her way to the exit. As she passed through the doorway and back into the foggy night, a chill swept over her, as if the manor itself was bidding her farewell. And as she glanced back one last time, she thought she saw a faint, flickering glow in the distance, a lantern bobbing gently in the mist, Edward Barnes, forever watching, forever bound to Stewart Manor. Adelphi University in Garden City, New York, held an unusual reputation. Nestled among quiet suburban streets, the campus seemed ordinary enough by day, with students bustling between buildings and leafy trees swaying in the breeze. But by night, Adelphi's atmosphere shifted. Students whispered about a haunting presence within Livermore Hall, one of the oldest buildings on campus, where mysterious shadows lurked and chilling sounds echoed down empty corridors. The stories passed from student to student spoke of a ghostly figure seen wandering the hallways, a woman in vintage clothing, her presence accompanied by strange occurrences that left witnesses cold with fear. The tale was rooted in tragedy, dating back to the early 1900s. According to legend, Eleanor Whitmore, a young woman who once studied at Adelphi, had vanished on campus under mysterious circumstances. Some said she had suffered a fatal accident. Others believed she had simply disappeared, lost forever in the winding corridors of Livermore Hall. Her body was never found, and whispers of her lingering spirit began almost immediately. Late-night visitors claimed to have seen Eleanor's apparition, her face pale and sorrowful, drifting silently through the building. Some even reported hearing soft, mournful humming, as if she were singing to herself from beyond the grave. One chilly autumn night, a freshman named Jack Harris found himself alone in Livermore Hall. Jack was no believer in ghost stories, brushing off the tales as nothing more than campus folklore designed to frighten new students. But that night, he needed a quiet space to study, and with the rest of the campus closed down, Livermore Hall seemed like the perfect refuge. As he settled into an empty classroom, his footsteps echoed in the silence, bouncing off the cold stone walls and high arched windows. The atmosphere felt different at night, though, and as Jack began to read, a chill seemed to settle over the room. The air was thick and unnaturally still, almost as if the building itself was holding its breath. His eyes flickered to the doorway more than once, a strange sense of unease creeping into his mind. It was as if someone or something was watching him, lurking just out of sight. Shaking off his nerves, Jack tried to focus, but a sudden sound made him freeze. It was a faint rustling, followed by a light tapping sound from somewhere down the corridor. He turned his head, straining to listen, his pulse quickening. The noise grew louder, like footsteps shuffling closer, echoing down the darkened hallway. Swallowing his apprehension, Jack decided to investigate, his curiosity overpowering his growing fear. He grabbed his flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the hallway. His footsteps were soft against the cold stone floor as he moved toward the sound. The corridor was dimly lit, with only the faint glow of old, flickering bulbs illuminating the way. Shadows stretched and danced along the walls, their shapes twisting and elongating as he walked. He reached the end of the hall and found nothing but silence, yet the air was colder here, a deep, bone-chilling cold that made his skin prickle. As he turned to head back, he felt a presence behind him, a soft, nearly imperceptible sigh, like a breath on the back of his neck. Jack froze, his breath catching as he felt the cold whisper of air against the back of his neck. Slowly he turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he scanned the empty corridor. The beam sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing, only the shadowed walls and the eerie silence of Livermore Hall. He shook his head, chuckling nervously, trying to convince himself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination. But as he started to turn back, a faint sound drifted down the hallway, sending a shiver up his spine. It was a soft, distant humming, a mournful, lilting tune that seemed to echo from deep within the building. The sound grew louder, filling the cold, empty space around him. Jack strained to hear, his heart pounding as he recognized the melody as an old lullaby, one his grandmother used to sing to him as a child. Yet there was something unsettling about it now, something hollow and sorrowful, as though the singer were trapped in a state of eternal despair. Against his better judgment, Jack moved toward the sound, drawn by a strange compulsion he couldn't explain. The humming seemed to pull him forward, guiding him deeper into the labyrinth of shadowed hallways. The corridor twisted and turned, each corner leading him further from the familiar parts of the campus into areas long forgotten. His flashlight flickered, casting brief glimpses of dusty shelves, forgotten paintings, and doors that hadn't been opened in years. The sound led him to a narrow staircase he hadn't noticed before, its steps old and worn, descending into darkness. He hesitated, feeling a rush of cold air emanating from the stairwell, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. But the humming grew louder, echoing from somewhere below, as if beckoning him to follow. Unable to resist, Jack took a shaky breath and began to descend, each step creaking beneath his weight as he plunged further into the depths of Livermore Hall. The lower level was even colder, the air thick and oppressive, pressing down on him as though the weight of the building itself was trying to smother him. His flashlight cast weak beams across the stone walls, revealing an old, abandoned basement filled with discarded furniture, broken desks, and piles of forgotten books. Shadows crowded the edges of his vision, flickering and shifting as though alive, twisting into strange shapes that vanished the moment he looked directly at them. And then he saw her. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by shadows, stood the faint figure of a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her form translucent, with wisps of dark hair falling around her pale, expressionless face. Her eyes were downcast, fixed on something just beyond his sight, and her hands were clasped tightly at her chest, as if cradling an invisible object. Jack's heart pounded, his mind screaming to run, but he found himself unable to move, trapped in the icy grip of fear. The woman's head tilted ever so slightly, her gaze lifting until her hollow, sorrowful eyes met his. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming wave of despair wash over him, a sadness so deep it seemed to resonate from the very walls. She opened her mouth, and the humming stopped, replaced by a silence that pressed against him, thick and suffocating. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke, her words echoing through the empty basement like the remnants of a long-lost memory. "Why have you come?" Jack's breath caught in his throat as the woman's voice echoed through the darkened basement, her words lingering in the air like the remnants of an ancient curse. He tried to speak, to answer her, but his voice died in his throat. The woman's hollow eyes bore into him, her expression both sorrowful and hauntingly intense, as though she could see straight through to his soul. In her gaze, he felt the weight of untold years, a life lost to darkness, trapped within these forgotten halls. Suddenly, her form flickered, and the temperature dropped even further, making Jack shiver uncontrollably. The flashlight in his hand dimmed, its beam weakening as if being drained by some unseen force. The woman took a single step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, like a shadow sliding across the floor. Jack's heart pounded, his body screaming at him to run, yet he remained rooted to the spot, mesmerized and terrified, as though the woman had cast a spell over him. The silence pressed down on him, broken only by a soft whisper that drifted from her lips, her voice carrying a hint of anguish. "They all left me. Abandoned, forgotten," she murmured, her gaze shifting past him, as though she was looking back in time, reliving memories of a world she could no longer touch. Her translucent hands clenched, fingers curling as if clutching something that had long since crumbled to dust. Jack felt an inexplicable sadness welling within him, an intense sorrow that seemed to emanate from the woman, wrapping around him like the fog outside. And then, with another flicker, her figure grew sharper, more defined. Her eyes bore into his with an unsettling intensity as she repeated, "Why have you come?" Her voice was stronger this time, filled with an underlying anger that sent a chill down his spine. Jack managed to find his voice, stumbling over his words as he tried to explain. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I was just curious about the stories. I didn't think they were real." At his response, her expression softened, her face taking on a look of deep, unfulfilled longing. "Real," she whispered, the word rolling off her tongue like a forgotten lullaby. She seemed to consider this as if remembering what it meant to be real, to exist outside the shadowed walls of this place. Her gaze drifted down, the sorrow returning to her eyes, her hands relaxing as her form began to fade. The lantern in Jack's hand flickered once more, its light nearly extinguished. But just as her figure began to vanish completely, she reached out, her hand brushing through the air as if trying to touch him. "Don't forget me?" she murmured, her voice barely more than a breath. Her form wavered, dissolving into mist, her final words lingering in the air like an unfinished thought. And then, she was gone. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, filling the space where she had been. Jack staggered backward, his heart racing, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls as he fled from the basement, from Levermore Hall, from the memory of the sorrowful spirit who had once walked Adelphi's halls. As he reached the exit and burst into the cold night air, he glanced back at the silent building, half expecting to see her watching from one of the windows. But there was nothing, only darkness. Yet as he turned to leave, he thought he heard a faint, mournful humming drifting through the fog, as if Eleanor Whitmore was singing her lullaby one last time, bound forever to the shadows of Adelphi University. St. Paul's School in Garden City had long been a place of hushed whispers and eerie glances, its halls and classrooms abandoned for years, standing like a relic of another time. During the day, it seemed almost peaceful, a crumbling piece of history framed by rustling trees. But at night, the place transformed, its darkened windows staring out like vacant, watchful eyes, as if the building itself were aware. Locals told chilling stories about those who dared to enter after dark, especially about one spirit who roamed the shadows, the ghost of Annabelle Gray, a young girl who had vanished within the school decades ago. The story, passed down and reshaped over time, told of Annabelle, a bright yet lonely student at St. Paul's in the late 1920s. One winter evening, she failed to return home after school. When her teachers searched, they found only her small, embroidered ribbon on the stairwell. But Annabelle herself was gone. Days turned to weeks, then months, yet no trace of her ever appeared. Rumors spread that Annabelle's spirit had stayed, lost within the very halls where she'd once roamed, her presence lingering as if she were searching for something, or waiting. One autumn night, a local filmmaker named Thomas Hale decided to document St. Paul's eerie reputation. Fascinated by ghost stories, he was determined to capture the supernatural on film. Armed with his camera, flashlight, and a portable microphone, Thomas entered the deserted school grounds. The air was sharp and cold, filled with the crisp scent of falling leaves, and an unnatural silence blanketed the building. The only sounds were his footsteps echoing softly as he made his way through the front doors, which groaned as if unwilling to let him pass. Inside, the school was an unsettling blend of decay and memories. Dust-coated desks lined the classrooms, and old books lay abandoned on shelves, their spines cracked and faded. In the hallway, faded posters from school events hung crookedly on the walls, untouched for decades. A strange chill ran through him as he moved deeper into the school, the beam of his flashlight flickering, casting warped shadows that twisted and stretched along the empty corridors. Suddenly, Thomas heard something, a faint, rhythmic thumping from above, like the sound of small, hurried footsteps. His heart raced, but his curiosity kept him moving forward. He aimed his camera up the stairwell, capturing the shadowed banisters and the peeling wallpaper. Each step he took seemed to amplify the sound, as though he were approaching something alive. He swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight tighter as he slowly ascended, the temperature dropping with every step. At the top of the stairs, he paused, scanning the darkened corridor. And then he saw it. A small, delicate handprint in the dust on the banister, as if a child had rested her fingers there. The sight sent a shiver through him, the air around him growing heavy, thick with an unexplainable sadness. His flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow. A faint, child-sized figure at the end of the hallway, standing perfectly still, as though she were waiting for him to follow. Thomas's heart raced as he stared down the dimly lit hallway, his gaze fixed on the small figure at the end. She stood motionless, almost blending into the shadows, her head slightly tilted as though she were studying him. He raised his camera, trying to focus on her, but the lens refused to capture anything more than a blur, as if the figure itself resisted being caught on film. Frustrated yet intrigued, he lowered the camera, daring to take a few slow steps forward, each one echoing softly in the cold silence. As he approached, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, disappearing from view like a wisp of smoke. Thomas quickened his pace, nearly running to the spot where she'd been standing. But when he reached the end of the corridor, there was nothing, just empty air and dust-covered floorboards. He exhaled a shaky breath, the silence pressing in around him once more, almost as if the building were holding its breath, waiting. Then, a faint giggle drifted through the air, childlike and eerie, echoing down the hall from somewhere just out of sight. Thomas's skin prickled, his heart pounding as he swung his flashlight around, scanning the hall. The sound was unmistakable. A girl's laugh, filled with both innocence and something more chilling, like a memory trying to claw its way back to the present. Following the sound, he found himself drawn to a nearby classroom, its door slightly ajar, casting a thin sliver of darkness onto the floor. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly, and stepped inside. The room was silent and abandoned, with rows of empty desks and chairs coated in a thick layer of dust. His flashlight swept across the room, revealing faded chalk drawings on the blackboard, childlike sketches of flowers, stars, and a small house. But as his beam passed over the far wall, he froze. Written faintly in the dust, as if traced by a delicate finger, was a single word: Annabelle. A chill washed over him as he stared at the name, the letters barely visible yet somehow unmistakable. The air grew colder, so frigid he could see his breath clouding in the faint beam of his flashlight. The oppressive silence had returned, heavier than before, pressing down on him, filling him with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. He felt as though he'd intruded on something deeply personal, as though he were trespassing in a place haunted not just by a spirit but by a memory, an emotion that refused to die. Just then, a soft shuffling sounded from the far corner of the room. Thomas's flashlight flickered as he turned toward the noise, his hand trembling slightly. In the corner, partially obscured by shadows, stood the small figure once more. Her face was still hidden, but he could make out the outline of her form, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, and her dress slightly tattered, as though she'd been wandering these halls for years. The girl lifted her head, her face still obscured by shadows, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of sadness in her posture, a loneliness that echoed through the empty room. And then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she spoke. "Why did you come here?" Thomas's breath caught in his throat as her soft, mournful question echoed through the empty classroom, filling the air with a sadness so deep it seemed to soak into the walls. He took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching out toward her, though he knew he could never touch her, never bridge the chasm between them. Her head tilted, and though her face was still obscured, he could feel her eyes on him, penetrating, as if she were studying him from the other side of a dark, forgotten place. I wanted to understand," he stammered, his voice sounding small in the vast silence, "to see if the stories were real." The girl didn't respond. She only stood there, motionless, a quiet sorrow emanating from her figure that made Thomas's heart ache. In that moment, he understood she wasn't just a ghost. She was a memory bound to this place, a fragment of a life that had ended too soon, yet somehow persisted, trapped within these decaying walls. As he watched, she lifted her small hand, extending it toward him, the delicate outline of her fingers barely visible in the dim light. She seemed to be offering something, or perhaps reaching out, as if hoping he could somehow pull her from the darkness. Thomas swallowed hard, his hand hovering just inches from hers, his fingers trembling as they passed through the icy air where her hand should have been. The chill intensified, and for a brief second, he felt a brush of cold, like the faintest touch of fingertips, and then she pulled back, retreating into the shadows. Her form began to fade, slipping into the dark corners of the room, dissolving like mist. "Don't leave me." Her whisper was barely audible, a fragile plea that tugged at his heart. As she vanished, a gust of cold air swept through the room, sending a scattering of dust into the air, swirling around him before settling back into silence. He was alone again, the room empty and dark, but her presence lingered, filling the air with a heavy, aching sadness. As he turned to leave, his flashlight cast one last glance across the chalkboard. The word Annabelle had disappeared, replaced by another message, faint but clear. "Help me." The words were like a final plea, an echo of a life cut short, a call for something Thomas could never provide. The weight of it pressed on him, and he felt a sudden urge to escape, to leave this place and the sorrow it held. He walked quickly back down the hall, his footsteps loud in the quiet, his mind reeling from the encounter. As he passed the staircase where he'd first seen her footprint, he glanced back one last time, his heart hammering. The halls were empty, silent, yet he could almost sense her there, watching, waiting. When he finally stepped outside, the air felt lighter, but the chill of the school still clung to him, as if he'd carried a piece of her sorrow with him. As he walked away, he thought he heard the faintest sound of laughter, or perhaps it was a sob, carried by the night wind. He didn't look back. Yet even as he left St. Paul's School behind, he knew he would never truly be free of what he had witnessed. The memory of Annabelle Gray and her whispered plea would haunt him forever, a ghost not just of the school, but of his own mind, forever tied to that dark, lonely place.